On November 9th through 10th, 1938, Nazi leaders unleashed a series of programs against the Jewish population in Germany and recently incorporated territories. This event came to be called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, because of the shattered glass that littered the streets after the vandalism and destruction of Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and homes.
We are honored by the presence today of Mr. and Mrs. Tobias. They're going to be here to tell us their stories and to interact with our Global Perspective students here at Buffalo Creek Middle School. It's especially meaningful today as it is a solemn anniversary of Kristallnacht. So we're going to start out by having Mr. and Mrs. Tobias just share their stories. They have some reflections on this anniversary day, and then you'll be able to ask them questions. Mr. Tobias or Mrs. Tobias?
The night of November 9th through 10th, 1938, was Kristallnacht. It is considered the beginning of the Holocaust. Approximately 400 people were murdered or driven to suicide. More than 1,400 synagogues and places of worship, as well as about 7,500 businesses and homes were destroyed. Jewish cemeteries and other Jewish communities were ravaged. In the following days, the Gestapo arrested around 30,000 Jewish men, including my father-in-law, and hauled them to concentration camps where hundreds were murdered or died. Most of the surviving detainees were released again after a few weeks or months. Now, I don't know if you can imagine that at the conclusion of the Holocaust, 6 million plus Jews were murdered. And if you can imagine Chicago and Los Angeles without a living soul in them, that is how much 6 million people are. And that's how many Jews were killed by the Nazis.
I was living in Berlin with my parents and approaching my 6th birthday on Kristallnacht. I will never forget that night and will quote from my book, Strange Haven, about how we spent that night. We kept the curtains in our apartment in Berlin drawn and used no lights to make it appear as if no one was home. My parents told me to be as quiet as possible. We tiptoed around our apartment in our socks, made do without running water, and did not use any knives, forks, or plates. My mother prepared enough sandwiches for the whole day and put them on the kitchen table along with cups of milk and water. When my parents brought me a sandwich, I forced myself to swallow a few bites. The finger in front of their parted lips made it impossible to tell them that it hurt me to swallow because my throat was so dry. We spent most of that day and night in bed, getting up only when we had to. Kristallnacht passed slowly, in darkness and in silence, interrupted only by our frightened reactions whenever the sounds of shattering glass made their way into our apartment from the street below. After Kristallnacht ended and was safe to go out again, we finally left the apartment. I walked with my parents, clutched their hands. A Jewish family owned a grocery store near our house on Metzerstraße, and I often went there to pick up things for my parents. The store was empty now, its windows smashed, and shattered glass was scattered all over the sidewalks in front of the shop. I turned my face away from the words "dirty Jew," which was splattered all over the store. We walked away quickly and headed for our synagogue nearby, in Rickerstraße. When we passed the synagogue entrance, located near a large courtyard, we saw a mountain of smoking ashes in the center of the street. I saw that the mound consisted of burned prayer books and was terrified to recognize the charred handles of the Holy Torah scrolls sticking out of the center of the simmering ashes. I was taught to honor and respect the Torah. I was taught that the whole congregation would fast if the Torah was ever dropped, even by accident during services. Now the Nazis had burned the Torahs as if they were nothing but trash. I suddenly knew there was no safety for us anywhere.
We could go back from the beginning, if each of you would just kind of give an overview of where you grew up and your stories, ultimately with your escape.
Sure. Well, after Kristallnacht, my father, who was a very brave man, decided that realized we had to leave Germany, and you don't really know this. It was never difficult to leave Germany. The difficulty was no country was willing to accept Jews. That's why 6 million Jews were killed. You may not know this, but there was a ship called the St. Louis with 800 Jewish refugees arrived in New York in 1937 or 38. They refused entry, so they headed for Cuba. The State Department cabled Cuba not to let them enter, and they didn't. So they returned to Europe. Of those 800, half of them did not survive. That was the story of the St. Louis, and you can look it up and you'll find references to that. So those are very difficult times because the United States State Department at that time was in the hands of some very anti-Semitic people. Breckinridge Long was a well-known anti-Semite who was in charge of immigration, and they made it as difficult as possible for Jews to immigrate into the United States. And that is why 6 million Jews were killed. It's not because they didn't want to leave Germany. It's because no other country was willing to accept them. So while Germans did the killing, the responsibility for the Holocaust belonged to all the country that refused entry to refugees. That's why today my sympathy is very much with the refugees who try to enter our country. These are typically poor people looking for a better way of life, coming from desperate straits, and I feel great sympathy for their plight. And I wish we would treat them more reasonably and charitably. Because the fact of the matter is, this is a country of immigrants. You are all children and grandchildren of immigrants. The only people who are native to this country are American Indians. So we are all immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. And it's important for us to understand that and have sympathy for today's immigrants who are often trying to escape extremely difficult conditions in South America. And my sympathies are entirely with them. And I hope that you see them in a different light after having listened to us today. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Can you just briefly go over your route out of Germany?
Sure. As I said, after Kristallnacht, my father tried to leave, and he got himself smuggled into Belgium. He was caught on the border and imprisoned in the Dachau concentration camp. Dachau was a brutal camp. Even though they had gas chambers, they didn't use them. Despite that, 46,000 people were killed in Dachau. 46,000. That's bigger than the population of this area. Imagine all of the people living in this area and surrounding areas were killed for only one reason, because they were Jews. So in any event, what happened was that my father ended up in Dachau. Now Dachau was a notorious concentration camp, as I mentioned to you. Laura and I visited it after the war, and as I said, 36,000 people were killed there, even though they did not have gas chambers. And one of the things my mother found out, who was very brave at that time, she heard that you could be released from Dachau if you could leave the country. If you could leave the country, my father wouldn't need to get smuggled into Belgium. It was always the problem. Remember, the problem was never leaving Germany. The problem was that none of the democracies of the world, including sadly this country, were willing to accept the refugees. And by luck, my mother heard that she could go into the Japanese occupied portion of Shanghai without a visa. And she immediately booked ship's passage and went to Dachau, got my father released, and he took actually a German freighter, the Fulda, around Africa to Shanghai, and she and I followed 6 months later, and we spent the next 10 years living in Shanghai. And after that, Shanghai had a community of approximately 20,000 refugees from Europe, people like us who had fled the Nazis' onslaught, the Nazi holocaust, and gathered in Shanghai. Perhaps the most famous of the people were, some of you may have heard of Peter Blumenthal, who was President Carter's Secretary of the Treasury. He was in Shanghai with us. And there were a number of other notable people in that community that I don't want to talk about right now. At the end of that period, what happened was that as during the war, amusingly enough, the Japanese originally had no particular prejudice against Jews. The German ambassador pressured them when he heard that 30,000 Jews had gathered in Shanghai. He pressured them to annihilate us. He urged them that the thing to do is to put us on a series of decrepit Chinese junks, tow us out to the Yellow Sea and sink us. He said no one would ever miss them. To their everlasting credit, the Japanese refused to do that. What they did do, they interned us in a ghetto during the war. The amusing sidelight to that is, my father is probably the only human being who was in a German concentration camp and a Japanese ghetto in the same war, and managed to survive both, fortunately. So as I said, we were in this ghetto, and things were difficult in the ghetto. Malnutrition was difficult to get good food. Europeans had difficulty adjusting to the Chinese environment. TB was rampant, and we didn't have enough medication to deal with TB. There's also some cholera, etc. And we ended up filling 3 cemeteries in Shanghai because Europeans didn't have resistance to some of the bugs that were endemic to that environment. The single largest loss of life of Jews in the ghetto of Shanghai was November 17th, 1945. And what do you think it was? An American air raid blasted the ghetto. Until then, we had the illusion that the Americans knew we were here and we would wave to the planes. We heard after the war what happened was that there was a major Japanese communication center in the ghetto, and that the bombs were intended for the communication center. But bombing was not very accurate then, and it ain't very accurate now. And 31 refugees were killed in an American bombardment on July 17, 1945. The reason that was so sad, of course, a month later the war was over. And basically, as I said, the Japanese treated us correctly. They weren't good to us, but they weren't bad to us either, because they could easily have killed us and put us on the junks, and no one would ever have missed us. But they simply left us to our own devices. And fortunately, the refugees developed their own newspaper, etc., and a nice sense of community. And suddenly one day in 1945, I remember one day waking up in early August, and the Japanese had disappeared. It's then that we realized that the war was finally over. And a few days later, we heard that an American tank, had arrived out of a plane. Of course, it was a Jeep. We didn't know about Jeeps. And shortly thereafter, we found out that the American troops arrived. And then we heard about the Holocaust. We knew nothing about that. 14 aunts, uncles, and cousins of mine were killed in Europe in the Holocaust. These were not as names. I had lived, laughed, and cried with every one of them, and would never do that again. Most of the other refugees had similar stories. So while we rejoiced at the end of the war, when the news of the Holocaust reached Shanghai, there was enormous sadness, and Jews usually say a prayer called the Kaddish for the dead. And there was a huge meeting of all the synagogues, there were about 3 in Shanghai, where we said the Mass Kaddish for the 6 million Jews who had been slaughtered in Europe. And we suddenly recognized we had lived through some very difficult times. Malnutrition, American bombing, the Japanese ghetto. And we suddenly recognized we were in paradise compared to what would have happened to us had we been in Europe. So our salvation was living in Shanghai. And in 1948, I had the good fortune of immigrating to the United States. My parents followed me a year later. I was here a year by myself. And I loved being in this country. And I took advantage of the educational opportunities offered. I went to school at night. I did college at night, working full-time during the day because my parents needed my support. So I got my bachelor's degree. And then I got a fellowship while I was doing my master's degree in school psychology. And then I got another fellowship to do my doctorate in clinical psychology. And finally ended up as a doctor having a doctorate in clinical psychology. And I taught for 33 years at the City University of New York, and followed that up for 5 more years teaching at Fordham University. And I never knew when it was enough. I ended up with another 7 years at Teachers College, Columbia University. And I have to tell you, I enjoyed my academic career enormously. I had 150 publications as a researcher, books, articles, periodicals, etc. But despite all of that, I really enjoyed teaching as much as I'm enjoying speaking to you today. And you can just see that I'm having a good time. And I liked my career very much. And even though I was a clinical psychologist and could have made a lot more money in private practice, I much prefer teaching. I much prefer teaching young people and giving them a sense of the world that awaited them outside of that. And finally, after 33 years of that, as I said, I spent 5 more years at Fordham University at Teachers College. And then we retired here. We now live in Sarasota and have the pleasure of speaking to you today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tobias. Now, Mrs. Tobias, could you tell your story? Your way out of Germany was much different.
Very different. You're all familiar with the date 1620. That was the year the British or the English settlers or immigrants landed on this coast in the United States, up in New England. For me, the year that's important is 1653. That's when my first ancestor came into the little town of Schriesheim in southern Germany. Where he came from, I don't know, but I know he came there. He had a wife, he had children, and he settled in that little village, and I'm the 10th generation of one family to have lived and have been born there in Schriesheim. It's a word for a lot of people have trouble pronouncing. My family lived there. They did well over the years. They owned a house, they owned property. The family grew. My grandfather was one of 9 siblings. So they were integrated into the village. But when they first came there in 1653, they had to get permission from the town council to be allowed to stay and to pay a hefty tax called the Jew tax. Well, over the years, there was somebody of the family who always stayed in this village. And as I said, I was the 10th generation of one family to have born in this village. We were forced to leave in 1938 because of the Hitler laws. Things became very difficult for Jews. A lot of my father's and my mother's relatives thought they could find safety by going to Holland because it was neutral during the First World War, so they thought it would be safe from Hitler, and they went there. Others stayed behind. We had a relative here, my mother's brother, who came here in 1936, and he saw the handwriting on the wall, and he said, "You've got to get out of Germany." In order to get out of Germany, we needed an affidavit. An affidavit is somebody to sponsor you, that when you came to this country, you would not be dependent on the state, you would not accept welfare, you had to make do on your own. Well, we got the affidavit, and after the affidavit, we needed a visa from the United States consul. Again, we had to pass an exam, and I had an uncle who had lived with us. As a child, he had meningitis, so let's say he was handicapped. He could read and write, but the United States government, because of his infirmity, would not give him a visa. So we had to leave him behind. And I remember it was such a sad day when I said goodbye to him, because when nobody else had time for me to take me sledding and protect me from the Nazi thugs, he was always there to protect me. Well, we said goodbye to him, boarded the train, got on the ship, and we landed here in 1938. World War I started September 1st, 1939. By that time, we were here in the United States. We had been accepted. My parents worked very hard. But in order to get a job, they were immigrants. They had to get a permit to be able to work. So my mother did almost anything she could. She cleaned houses. She was a fabulous baker. So she would bake cakes and she would sell them. My father worked very hard, but we were together, the four of us, my mother, my father, me, and my grandfather, who at that time was 81 years old. Interestingly enough, he had no trouble getting a visa from the United States government, but my uncle did not. Anyhow, we were here and we became immigrants in the United States. One of the dates that I remember was December 7th. That was the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. I'm sure you read about that in your studies in 1941. And suddenly, things changed. I mean, we had felt free. We were in the United States. We were able to work, hard as it was. And suddenly, with the outbreak of the war, here we were refugees escaping Hitler, and suddenly we were considered enemy aliens. We had to register as enemy aliens. We're not allowed to, we were living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania then. We were not allowed to leave unless we had written permission. So my mother could not get a job in a defense plant because, what would she steal? She was inspecting bullets or some other thing. But anyhow, we survived, and then when the war was over, we finally found out what had happened to our relatives. Our large extended family who had sought refuge in Holland, they all perished. So from a very large family became a very small family, very few. And as I said, I'm the last child born in that village and the last person alive telling you the story, what happened to the Jews in Schriesheim. And now that's my story.
Thank you, Ms.
Mr. and Mrs. Tobias, I want to know, how did you two meet?
I can't hear you.
Speak up.
She wants to know how you met.
Oh.
And Mrs. Tobias meet?
I'm sorry.
How we met.
How did
How did
How
you
we
meet?
met? Well, I was working in the college bookstore. I was working my way through school. And we had, in the bookstore, we had discount tickets to a concert series on our campus. And my lady who was attending the concerts heard, and she was attending on a regular ticket. She heard that I had discount tickets. So she decided that it was good to get a hold of me so she could get a discount ticket. And here we are, 60, 70 years later. And so I think she made a good investment in the discount ticket.
And you know how much the tickets were? This'll shock you. 30 cents.
And the discount ticket allowed you to have 50%. So that was intended for students. So for the 30-cent ticket, you got the 15 cents. And my lady, who was always, very economically minded, decided it was important to get the discount.
And it was where we attended at City College, or the stadium where we were sitting on concrete seats. It was the summer home of the New York Philharmonic. And I've always loved music, and I said, well, hey, I can get cheap tickets for this guy, because it'll, two purposes. I can meet him, and I can date him, and I can hear music.
Thank you, Julie.
I never knew which was more important. Thank you.
Are you guys
Speak up.
sorry, did you guys ever if you did you guys practice Judaism? And if you did, are you still practicing?
Yes. There was a period, frankly, after the Holocaust, when it became very difficult to believe in a God. Because I said to myself, what kind of a divinity would permit the death of 6 million Jews? By the way, you have an idea how many of those do you think were kids under 16? 1.5 million. Of the 6 million Jews who were killed, 1.5 million were under 16. And so for some time, frankly, I was very upset with Judaism and didn't practice at all. And then I fell under the influence. I was a visiting professor at Florida State University, and I met a man called Michael Berenbaum. He was a rabbi, but he was studying for his doctorate. He is now at the University of Judaism, became very well known. He worked in the Carter White House for President Carter. And he gradually brought me back to Judaism, gradually. And now we belong to a synagogue, and I participate very actively. But it took some time. It took probably a dozen years for me to reaffiliate actively with Judaism. And it's always difficult on the days when we meet to commemorate the people killed in the Holocaust. Those are always very moving days, and I usually participate in them. Very well.
That's not a problem for Parker.
Good.
I was wondering if after the war, if you guys wanted to move back to Germany, or did you want to stay in America?
I had no desire to move back to Germany. As a matter of fact, I refused for years to buy any German products. We've never owned a Volkswagen, never in our life. But after many, many years, I had an interesting experience. We were vacationing in Mexico, and we met some young German people who were born after the war. And typically what Laura and I did, we always avoided, when we ran into Germans, we always avoided Germans who were our age or older, because we figured they were part of the troubles that we had endured. And when we met these young people, I suddenly recognized that they had nothing to do with that, because they were born after the war. And they expressed as much horror of the war as I did. And after that, it was easier for me to interact with Germans who were our age. frankly, to this day, I still have some difficulty interacting with German people who were older than I, because I figured they had something to do with it. But I don't know, is that the question you asked? Okay. Laura, did you want to add to that?
I went back to the place where I was born numerous times. The house that my family owned, they bought it in 1840, and we sold the house when we had to immigrate to the United States in 1938. The house was built, let's say, in the 1700s. So it's a long history of a relationship to the village and what was happening there. On one of the trips, I took my granddaughter there because she had heard me tell stories about the house, the school I went to, how I was discriminated, how I could not go to school anymore, how I was kicked out of school, how to go to a private school in Heidelberg, a private Jewish school. And Jessica was very interested to see the house that the family had owned and the people who, the grandchildren of the people who bought a house. There were 3 sisters, and they were very eager for me to go through the house and show it. And so Jessica saw the house. We went to the Jewish cemetery, which is adjacent to the Christian cemetery. The town keeps it up. I wanted to give them money to make sure the graves were in good shape. They said, no, that is our responsibility. So I have a very good feeling about going back to Schliesheim. But, you know, my mother went back. She still had friends that were her friends when she was growing up. And this is interesting because by the time I was kicked out of school, the public school, and I had to go to the Jewish school in Heidelberg, and everybody thought we were all going to go to Palestine then. And we were taught a foreign language in order to prepare us for our trip out of Germany. They didn't teach us English. I learned Hebrew. So the first language I learned how to read outside of German was Hebrew. So, which I have not forgotten. I can still read some of it. But I'm still quite fluent in German. And I never forgot the language. And my father always said, you know, you cannot hold a language responsible for the actions of the people.
I have to add to that. On this trip back to Germany, Laura went to the school where she was persecuted very badly. Was it in the 2nd grade? The teacher did not call on her for 1 solid year and put her in a desk away from everybody else so that she wouldn't touch anybody. And my favorite moment of that trip was Laura went to the school, spread her arms, and said, "Ritorna vincitor," Italian for I have, and there's an aria from Verdi, we're both opera lovers. I have returned victorious. I'll never forget that moment. It was a wonderful moment.
German failed me. I could express my feelings in Italian from an opera.
So this kind of ties in what you guys were just talking about. But after Kristallnacht and the Holocaust happened, how was did you guys attend school? And if so, how was it like there?
Could you say that again, please? I had trouble hearing you.
He was asking about after Kristallnacht and as the Holocaust began, what your educational experience was after. I think you kind of...
Well, at that point after Kristallnacht, first of all, we didn't know about it. We didn't know about what was happening. We knew that we had lost track of our relatives. They could write to us, but you know, they wrote letters to us. It was censored, black lines through a lot of the text. So we had no idea what was going on. And there was very, very little written or talked about on the radio of the atrocities that the Germans did to the Jews, at least not in Germany. We really did not know what was happening. But my education was in the United States. But this was not a subject that was taught. You did not talk about it.
Yeah. I did not go to school in Germany because I was too young. I was 6. We had a school in Shanghai called the Shanghai Jewish Youth association school, which was founded by, they were wealthy Sephardic Jews living in Germany, in Shanghai, and they founded this school. That's where I learned English, in that school. And then, it was really very unusual, a yeshiva, which is a rabbinical seminary, also made its way to Shanghai. And in about 1942, I became very devout, and I left secular school, and for 5 years studied only rabbinical school. I studied Talmud 6 days a week. And frankly, when I came to the United States, I was very frightened. I had not had any secular education for 7 years, and I was wondering how I would do. And I studied like a madman for the midterms, and I got perfect scores on every test. And I decided this was a piece of cake compared to the Talmud, which is a very complicated study. And I got into the very bad habit of studying only the night before the exam, because I figured this was so easy. And despite that, I managed to get B+ grades pretty much throughout. And that bad habit stayed with me, unfortunately, through undergraduate school. Fortunately, it ended in graduate school because the stuff was just too difficult to cram. In graduate school, when I studied for my doctorate, I really worked hard and I did well, and then had a very successful career after that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Lily?
Yeah.
I was wondering how you guys deal with the trauma after.
How did we what?
Deal with the trauma of the Holocaust like that.
In Shanghai, when we heard about the Holocaust, my mother went into a depression, which she never really shook. For the rest of her life, she had depressive episodes, every few months, every few years. It was very difficult. As I said, the community got together, we all said the Kaddish, because everybody had lost somebody. And gradually, you get used to it. What happened in Shanghai was there was a German Jewish newspaper called the Aufbau, which we received by mail, and they began to publish lists of survivors and lists of people who had not survived, which is basically how we heard about the people. And gradually, it was, there was more sadness than joy, because there were always more people who'd gotten killed than there were survivors. And one of the things, gradually, life is not a bed of roses. And gradually you get used to dealing with the sadness and realize that continuing sadness doesn't help you in your day-to-day life. So I remember the 14 aunts, uncles, and cousins who were killed in the Holocaust vividly. And I say prayers for them in the synagogue 4 or 5 times a year when we have memorial prayers. And I wouldn't say they are a continuing presence, but I would certainly say I will never forget them. And it's something you learn to live with. It's part of life. We have had great joy. We've had 2 successful daughters. One of them was a professor at Johns Hopkins University. The other one who is a vice president of a major industrial firm. And we have a couple of grandchildren. So we have great satisfactions in our life. But there's an element of sadness which will never disappear. That's the way life is.
After the war ended, my family tried to find out what had happened to our various cousins, sisters, brothers, whom we had left behind. There were a number of agencies that helped you, and the Germans were excellent record keepers. So you go to an agency and you gave the name of the person, where they lived, and this way we found out what happened to our relatives whom we had left behind. Then we found out which of our relatives were sent to the different concentration camps, and this is very unusual, that you could find out. I mean, my grandmother, who had left Germany and went to Holland, and she was in her 70s, she was put on a cattle car to one of the very worst concentration camps called Sobibor. Everybody heard, a lot of people have heard of Auschwitz, but there were lots of other concentration camps that you have to search out. And after my father heard what happened to his mother and other relatives, he said he no longer could believe in God. He was a religious man, and he liked the holidays, he liked going to synagogue, he liked having Passover, and all of that. But did he believe in God? He said no. He said he will follow tradition, the tradition of being a Jew, but believing in God, he could no longer do.
How did your life change from like day to day when the Holocaust started?
When it started?
Like, how did your life change from before the Holocaust to when it started?
Oh. That's a very difficult question. You see, we were in Shanghai, so we didn't hear about it until after the war. And the first month after the war was a month of continual sadness and horror. And fortunately, the way life works is that gradually the horror decreases, and you pick up and you do, and then you live, and you eat, and you go to school, and you do your things, and the daily activities of living end up pushing some of the sadness aside. And gradually, over the years, it is reduced. It is never forgotten. It is reduced. It is reduced to the point that we can cope with it and talk about it today. I mean, both for Laura and me, we both lost a lot of relatives, but it's something we will never forget.
You know, we were immigrants. We didn't speak English. I became the translator. My mother had to go to night school to learn English. My father knew some English. But this is not anything that you knew about. It wasn't written up. First of all, the times would have been much too difficult to read. And it was just something that wasn't mentioned. And it wasn't until the war was over and records were opened up, and thank goodness for all the meticulous records that the Germans kept, were we able to find out what had happened to our relatives. I had 3 young cousins who survived the Holocaust. 2 were girls living in Holland, were fundamentalist Christians, hid them. So, and you know, they were raised as Dutch, and they spoke fluent Dutch because they had been living there. They were teenagers. So after the war, when they came to the United States, we found out what happened to the family. And I had one other cousin who was there with my uncle, the one who I mentioned who was handicapped, and he was in a concentration camp in southern France called Gurs. And he escaped from the camp, and he made his way on foot into Switzerland, and he crossed the Pyrenees. And again, when the war was over, he contacted us, and us did the girls, and then we helped bring them over to the United States, and that's when we found out what had happened to the family. Otherwise, it was, you know, it wasn't important to a lot of people. The Jewish community cared, but not my next door neighbors. They had their own problems to deal with. But this was not uppermost in their mind to find out what had happened.
I do want to add, Laura reminded me of something meticulous records. She said, when we went to Germany and I visited the Dachau concentration camp, it was not a pleasant trip for me, obviously. And we went into the archives and I gave him my father's name. And it took him 30 seconds and they produced a complete record of imprisonment. And they gave it to me. And if you ever read my book, I have a copy of it in my book. They had detailed records of it. I mean, and you know, the Germans are great record keepers. And 30, what is it, at that time it was 40, 50 years later, they had a complete record of his imprisonment. And I don't know whether the library here has a copy of my book, but if you get a copy of my book, you'll see that I reproduced a copy of his imprisonment in Dachau.
I want to add one thing. Interestingly enough, when you entered a concentration camp, and there was a sign in German, it said, in German it is Arbeit macht frei. Translated into English, it means work makes you free. So that when people were taken out of the trains and came into the concentration camp, this is the sign that greeted them: work makes you free. Well, very few of them were able to work. Most of them were killed in the concentration camps. Another bit of propaganda that the Germans spread among its own inhabitants. They're not really camps. They're going to work.
In Auschwitz, about 80% of the people were taken from the train to the gas chambers. And about 20% or so were put to work and then ended up in the gas chambers later. They ended up as doing various tasks. Some of them ended up actually, to their horror, of taking the dead bodies from the gas chambers into the crematorium. It was done by other prisoners. Horrible done. Horrible, horrible done.
Landon,
What do you think one of the most important takeaways from like?
Speak up a little.
What do you think one of the most important takeaways from the Holocaust? Or like, what's the most important takeaway from the Holocaust?
The most important lesson of the Holocaust? To me, the most important lesson is that it is extremely dangerous to hate a group of people, a race, a nation, etc. Nobody likes everybody. But once you start to say that all Mexicans are terrible, all Haitians are terrible, that is a horribly dangerous road. Of course, there are Mexicans I wouldn't want to be friendly with, and I'm sure there are Haitians. But once you generalize and say all people of one kind are horrible, that is the first step to a Holocaust. You can never, you should never, all of you should never fall into the trap of thinking of one group of people as being horrible people. There are good folks and there are bad folks in all races and in all types of people. Never make the mistake of saying all Hispanics or all blacks or all Jews or whatever are one thing or another. That is the first step to what eventually ends up being a Holocaust.
You know, there's the saying that people say, and they hear about the Holocaust, they say, never again. We should never again have something like this. It doesn't mean anything, because there is so much hatred for others that are not like me in the world, and who look down on others and discriminate. That we should not discriminate. We should say we will not discriminate. Everybody is the same in front of God or whatever you believe is. We should treat people equally and fairly, and not say, well, just because you're a different color, you're not my equal. And there's too much of that going on.
thank you so much, Mr. and Mrs. Tobias, for sharing your stories. We would love you if you're able to come back again, because I know many of the students did get a chance to ask your questions. But on behalf of my Global Perspective students, we want to thank you for honoring us with your presence today. Thank you very much.
And I hope you remember some of the things we talked about. And if you have questions, you can send them to Mr. Baker, and he will send them to me, and we will answer them. If you have questions, send them to Mr. Baker, and either Laura and I will be happy to respond to your email. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It was nice being here.